The Star Trek Section 31 movie is finally here, and I can already hear a ton of you saying, wait, there was a Section 31 movie coming out? Yeah, Paramount clearly decided to sneak this one out with all the fanfare of a cloaked Romulan warbird. The promotion for this thing has been fairly non-corporeal, which is kinda sad because I actually had some hopes for this movie. I know a lot of Trekkies dismissed it outright, especially after that first Beyonce trailer dropped and sent the fandom spiraling.
Okay, ladies, now let's get information.
This isn't Star Trek. Oh my god, is this what Star Trek's become?
Well, I kinda understood where some people were coming from. I didn't completely despise the trailer. Sure, it did have the flashy, trying a little bit too hard to be cool David Ayer Suicide Squad vibe.
You're a bad bitch.
But it also hinted that Section 31 might actually have its own distinct tone from the rest of the Star Trek franchise, which is something I actually really want Star Trek to do, and Michelle Yeoh is heading a Star Trek show.
You're a bad bitch.
Like, that's all I kind of needed to be interested, so as much as I have issues with the concept of a Section 31 show on its face, we'll get to that later on, I was really, really rooting for this one. But then I saw it, and now I completely understand why this movie was sent out to quietly die like a Tuvix. Too soon?
Doesn't anyone see that this is wrong?
Too soon. I'm gonna keep the first part of this video spoiler-free, and I'll give you all a heads up when I go into spoilers, but I really hate saying this. This is one of the worst Star Trek movies I have ever seen, and it's almost certainly the worst project in this current era of the franchise. And I say that as someone who has actually genuinely liked a lot of modern Star Trek, not you. Star Trek has made some bad movies over the years. I am still not entirely over Star Trek Nemesis and its treatment of Troy. Rick Berman's dislike of women was truly something else. But even the worst Trek movies still have a little bit of Star Trek vibe and charm to them. I mean, I even enjoy Final Frontier as a so bad it's good kind of mess.
What does God need with a starship?
Section 31, though, offends me less because it's outright bad, though it is that, and more because of how painfully generic it is. It's an incredibly by-the-numbers cookie-cutter sci-fi film that feels like it belongs alongside Netflix slop like Atlas. I bet even half of you don't even know that Atlas exists. The only mildly interesting thing about this movie is Michelle Yeoh's undeniable charisma and the fact that the Star Trek name is slapped onto it, with Easter eggs and references sprinkled in to remind you that it's technically Star Trek. The movie follows a Black Ops team from Section 31 as they recruit Michelle Yeoh's Mirror Universe Georgiou, spinning off from Star Trek Discovery, for a secret mission that may have ties to her past. Ooh. The movie is also set during what many Trekkies call the Lost Era, the 70 years between the end of the original series movies and the start of the Next Generation, an era that has only been glimpsed in a few episodes and a bunch of novels. Because of course I'm gonna reference Star Trek novels. But we don't actually know a ton about this time period in Star Trek outside of the Federation's growing diplomatic relationship with the Klingons and the Federation itself solidifying into a more utopian galactic power than it was in the original series. So it's actually really ripe for storytelling to flesh it out. But unfortunately what we get is a generic sci-fi crime thriller running through all of the motions with little imagination. We've got a quirky band of heroes, a heist, a starship battle. It's all there, but it feels more like it's checking boxes than telling a compelling story. And of course, the third act throws in yet another galaxy-ending threat, because if there's one thing modern Star Trek can't resist, it's the Federation or the galaxy is all at stake trope. These heightened stakes just feel so exhausting, and the villain, who I'll talk more about in spoilers, is painfully boring. Easily one of the blandest villains I've seen in a long time. They even rely on a certain villain trope that I often find offensive in other blockbuster-style movies, but it's executed so dully here that I can't even get too mad about it. Which is so disappointing because I really like the idea of one-off lower-budget Star Trek streaming movies. We've actually seen similar potential for this before with the Short Trek series, which I mostly enjoyed, especially the more experimental entries like The Trouble with Edward, The Girl Who Made the Stars, and Children of Mars that broke away from the initial batch of episodes that felt like they were just setting up Star Trek Discovery's second season. Like, they actually really experimented with tone a lot in those, and that format proved to audiences, and likely also probably the execs, that projects like Lower Decks, Prodigy, and Strange New Worlds, some of the best recent Trek series, could work. Even Star Trek Picard started as a concept for a short Trek, though I think we can forgive it for giving us that. But I think an anthology-style Trek format, be it shorts or movies, is a really excellent and kind of needed way to experiment with the franchise and keep it fresh, which is why this movie is disappointing, because it should have been a chance to take a wild swing with the franchise. I have a lot of respect for Olatunde Osunsami, who directed this movie. He's been a producer on Star Trek Discovery for most of its run, and from what I've heard from folks that I know who work on the series, and also from following Trek productions generally, he's been a major force behind the series' commitment to diversity and authenticity, something that is core to what Star Trek is to me. And I appreciated that Discovery itself took tangible steps to authentically depict cultures and marginalized communities, from hiring queer actors and people of color to enabling the art departments like costuming to research and create culturally rich designs. That authenticity is what made Discovery kind of stand out even from its contemporary Trek series. But sadly, for the most part, none of that richness that Osunsami brought to Discovery really comes through in Section 31. I mean, for example, as my cosplayer Trekkie friend Spotted Giraffe pointed out to me, the movie uses a lot of off-the-rack public fashion pieces to create a gritty, grungy vibe rather than having the costumes be actually designed, and it makes the world feel a little less unique. It robs the movie of any sense of cultural specificity and makes it kind of look like every other low-budget, gritty sci-fi movie out there. And it needs to be said, I'm also not a fan of the cinematography either on this thing. I don't know if this is a problem with Osunsami as a director, it's something that I've noticed in his work before, or if it's just a problem of this era of Trek's filmmaking, but nothing in this movie feels clear or given proper weight by the camera. I mean, for example, when Osunsami directed the Discovery Season 5 premiere, I was frustrated by how unclear the action was during a chase sequence, even during what should have been the most epic moment of that sequence, where we have two starships dropping down almost into a planet itself. There was no sense of spatial relationships or scale. None of it was shot with the same impact as, say, the Enterprise D crashing in Star Trek Generations. Instead, it just felt weightless. And here in this movie, we kind of have the same issue. I mean, during an action sequence, the main villain's big introduction shot is just this generic medium shot. Like, there's no menace, no weight behind him, nothing to make this moment feel impactful like it should. And the movie also leans heavily into the constant moving shots that modern Star Trek uses to mimic the kinetic energy of the J.J. Abrams films. And that approach can work. I actually really like that it gives Trek a distinct visual flair that helps it stand out in this era of streaming TV. And say what you will about the Kelvin films, I personally think Star Trek 2009 and especially Beyond rank on the upper end of Star Trek movies. But even if you don't like their visual style, I personally think they genuinely had some unique and intentional shot composition. But here in Section 31, the visuals feel unmotivated, with very few moments standing out. And in an episodic streaming TV series context, I can forgive a little bit of that, but as a movie, which this is sold as, this cinematography just does not hold up, even against other Star Trek films, including the Abrams ones that it's clearly trying to emulate. The whole movie just seems uninterested in using the film medium to its fullest, even in the most basic of ways. And again, I have to grade this as a movie, even understanding that it's a lower budget streaming movie versus a TV series. Like, that's the standard I kind of have to put it up against. The same even goes for the set design and locations. So much of this movie relies on the volume walls Trek and even Star Wars have been using a lot lately. And while those can work in small doses, I don't hate them outright. Here they just add to the generic empty feel, with so many locations looking like yet another big, wide open circular space. Like, seriously, look for this in Star Wars and Star Trek shows and you realize how often there are scenes just set in wide open expanses that feel very empty, and also sets that feel very circular. It's all because they're on the volume. And as a result, it all blends together visually in this film, leaving no real sense of place or personality. There's even one location they use multiple times in this movie, a barren junkyard where characters inexplicably go to just stand around and have meetings. And for some reason, and this just made me laugh every single time, there are just random streams of fire just spouting from objects in the background. It's like the movie trying to trick me into thinking these bland plot exposition scenes are interesting by throwing in like random fire effects. I could not get over it. It was honest to God hilarious. Speaking of cuts, this movie has an editing style where it constantly zooms in all the time, and it's really disorientating and looks cheap. Like they were trying to superficially add energy to scenes in post-production. Speaking of plot though, Section 31 originally started off as a series pitch spinning off from Star Trek Discovery, and it was set up in Season 3 when Georgiou left the show after she had already been in Section 31 back in Season 2. But despite having started development all the way back in 2019, it languished in development hell for years. And my personal conspiracy theory is that this show was actually completely dead, was not going to happen at all, until Michelle Yeoh won an Oscar for Everything Everywhere All at Once, and Paramount saw an opportunity to capitalize on her newfound spotlight. And I suspect they greenlit this as a movie just to test the waters to see if anyone's interested in a potential series, especially given how much Osun Sami, the cast, and a specific moment at the end of the film, which I won't spoil just yet, are clearly pushing for this to become a show. But for me, what kinda leaves a bad taste in my mouth from this switching from a series to a movie is the fact that the pitch's original creators, Bo Yoon Kim and Erica Lipholt, two women, one of whom is a woman of color, were pushed off the project and replaced by Craig Sweeney, who wrote the film. And nothing against Sweeney, but it really kind of sucks to see two creators get pushed off their own project, also kind of quietly so, like no one in the Trek fandom is talking about that. And on top of that, Star Trek is a franchise built on inclusion and diversity, and yet only one of its aired modern series, Discovery, which is now canceled, wasn't showrun by a cis straight white dude. And again, I say this as someone who genuinely adores a lot of those showrunners. Mike McMahon in particular has been incredibly kind to me personally, so I'm not like knocking any of them. I think they're all great writers. But I personally really want to see more perspectives get the chance to run a Star Trek show. It's something I think is necessary not just for Star Trek, but really needed right now, given the current political climate in the United States that we're in, as well as just the general state of Hollywood at the moment. And it just makes that all the more frustrating to see these women get replaced on their own project pitch. At least thank heavens that Tawny Newsome is currently working on a series and Noga Landau is heading the Starfleet Academy series. So at least that's nice to see for Star Trek going forward. But all that being said, it's also painfully apparent that this movie was stitched together from what was meant to be an episodic TV series. The 3 acts of the film do feel like separate episodes of a TV show, likely part of what was pitched as a season-long arc or the opening story of the series, and the film never really escapes that obvious structure. The film also crams in so much plot that it ends up drowning in exposition. I didn't time this out, but I would honestly take a bet that more than half the runtime of this movie is just characters standing around in a circle explaining the plot. They get in a circle, explain what the next generic action sequence is going to be, they do said sequence, and then we cut back to another exposition scene to set up the next sequence. It's a really repetitive cycle that never gives the story room to breathe. And it's all just a shame because there's real potential here to flesh out the character of Georgiou in meaningful ways, especially by delving deeper into her past as a fascist dictator and examining how much or how little she's changed since her introduction in Discovery. Yeoh was genuinely one of the best parts of Discovery's early seasons, and you could really feel her absence when she left. And I don't mean that as like a backhanded compliment. I'm actually pretty positive about those seasons overall, even with their many issues. I will at least acknowledge that I get why some people would feel conflicted about her being the central character of a Star Trek story. I mean, Mirror Universe Georgiou is introduced in Discovery right after just mass murdering a radical group resisting her fascist empire, and in her second episode, she's literally eating a Mirror Universe Saru, one of Discovery's most endearing characters.
Have my ganglia.
Her arc on the show, however, which sees her slowly becoming a better person through her interactions with Starfleet, is, to me, a very Trek story. But it also felt at times that it was carried more by Michelle Yeoh's incredible performance, more than the writing of the show itself, which didn't fully reckon with Georgiou's implied totalitarian deeds. So that's why I was really excited about this movie getting a chance to expand her character, and certainly the plot tries to do that, but instead of really delving deep into Georgiou's complicated past or character and how it might shape her redemption or not, the movie just gives us a watered-down villain who feels like a crowbarred-in concept to have her reckon with her past in very superficial ways. All that being said, Michelle Yeoh is, as always, clearly having fun as Georgiou.
Starfleet. Where fun goes to die. It took you long enough to find me.
But unlike Discovery, where she had strong characters and actors to bounce off of, here you can feel how hard she's just trying to inject personality into the proceedings.
I have a simpler idea.
The other characters around her are really forgettable. Quite literally, until I rewatched the movie a second time to write this review, I forgot some of them were there. Their roles and personalities are constantly told to us, sometimes explicitly so,
They're heavy on artillery, low on IQ.
rather than actually have them show us who they are. You have the bruiser dumb guy, the by-the-book stickler, and the gruff no-nonsense leader with a dark fan service-filled past. Instead, the movie tries to make the crew stand out by leaning a lot on their quirks during all the exposition, having them snipe and banter with each other to remind us what their roles are.
That suffers from what we call mecha dysmorphia.
And I may not know what that is, but I'm also not going to take that from you, Quaz, and personally, I'm offended.
But aside from a few exceptions, none of the cast managed to elevate these paint-by-numbers archetypes into something memorable. Sam Richardson is the only one matching Yo's energy. He somehow manages to make his character feel like a fully realized person, and his comedic timing occasionally gets a genuine laugh out of me, even with the bland dialogue and thin characterization that he's working with.
I could be intimidated by you right now. I mean, after all, you've murdered so many people. And you seem to be staring right into my soul.
I will say Sven Rygrock also deserves a little bit of a mention for his completely batshit performance of Fuzz.
I will kick your ass until you cannot form a solid mass of...
Fuzz, lock it down.
I am locked down.
Who, surprisingly by the way, is one of the movie's more intriguing sci-fi concepts. I'm not gonna spoil it here, but it's actually one of the very few genuinely unique ideas the film has to offer up the Trek universe. And it's just a shame that the rest of the movie's cast doesn't rise to either of their levels. But the big character I think most Trekkies are probably curious about is Casey Roll's Rachel Garrett, given that she's the most obvious way that the movie explores this specific era of Star Trek. As many Trekkies know, this character is destined to become the ill-fated captain of the Enterprise C from the classic Next Generation episode Yesterday's Enterprise, where she's given a lot of gravitas but not a ton of screen time. So we had plenty of opportunity to flesh her out. But here, she just comes across as the stereotypical, I follow the rules Starfleet officer with a stick up her ass.
And if I think we're putting Datano's life in danger by tinkering with that implant, I will unleash the full weight of Starfleet on this whole operation.
It's a very rote character, and she's never given anything more interesting to do or any depth beyond that. They had a real chance to make her unique, to give her a compelling arc that maybe explored who she is, or this time period of Star Trek, or even angling towards her future legacy, and they really just don't. She's just kind of here playing a stock character that I think you could have slotted any Starfleet type into. And what makes it all the worse is her role in the story. Starfleet actively assigns her to oversee the Section 31 team, which means that Starfleet has some oversight of Section 31, and that leans into the absolute worst aspects of the Section 31 show concept that I have always hated. When Section 31 as a concept was introduced in the later seasons of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, its entire purpose as a storytelling device was to reject the idea that such an organization had any place in a Star Trek future. It was portrayed as a clandestine group that was tasked with doing whatever it took, no matter how morally reprehensible, to protect the Federation's interest, including interfering in other nations' affairs. Essentially, it was the Federation's version of the CIA. The storyline of Dr. Bashir clashing with Section 31 agent Sloan was about rejecting that ideology. Sloan essentially was arguing that Bashir's idealism, and by extension the Federation's, was only possible because Section 31 protected his naive innocence.
Federation needs men like you, Doctor. Men of conscience, men of principle. Men who can sleep at night. You're also the reason Section 31 exists. Someone has to protect men like you from a universe that doesn't share your sense of right and wrong.
While Bashir argued, in some of my favorite episodes of the series, the exact opposite. That idealism isn't naive, that you can actually fight for it and prove it out.
I don't like it, but I've spent the last year and a half of my life ordering young men and young women to die. I like that even less.
That's a glib answer, and a cheap way to avoid the fact that you've trampled on the very thing that those young men and women are out there dying to protect!
And it's what makes the Federation's ideals worth defending, even when its own institutions fail to, which is a core theme of Deep Space Nine as a whole. After Deep Space Nine, Section 31 only popped up really briefly in a couple movies and later shows, where it was clearly still shown to be an overtly bad thing. It also appeared, by the way, in some banger novels. Like, if you have not read these Section 31 books, they're all pretty much great. In fact, this Next Generation one is one of the first Trek books to make an on-screen character gay in the novels. Because, of course, I would know weird, queer, nerdy shit like that. However, modern Star Trek shows have used Section 31 much more liberally and pretty much flatly ignored its original critique. It often feels like Section 31 is neoliberal propaganda, arguing for the necessity of a CIA-style organization, the exact idea that Deep Space Nine was rejecting.
Nation building is never pretty. That is the unappetizing truth, and you know it.
Wow. I hate it.
It steadily got worse over time. In Discovery's first season, the ship's spore drive was heavily implied, but never directly stated, to be a covert Section 31 Black Ops project, approved and run by Starfleet. But that season, at the very least, never explicitly stated it, and at least it also made clear that that mission was led by a literal fascist who was manipulating his hopeful Starfleet crew, as well as Starfleet generally, into becoming a war machine under the guise of Starfleet ideals so that he could get what he wanted.
And we must win the war. But that's just the beginning.
But Season 2 went even further, officially naming Section 31 and reframing it for the first time as an authorized, well-known, apparently, arm of Starfleet.
Section 31 may not be the shining beacon of righteous conduct you want it to be, but they are a critical intelligence division.
Rather than being a disavowed Black Ops group.
Starfleet sanctions what you're doing.
We don't submit reports or ask approval for specific operations, if that's what you mean. We are an autonomous department.
We even see Georgiou, as a Section 31 agent, infiltrate the Klingon Empire to back leaders friendly to the Federation's interests, essentially mirroring real-world CIA actions and coups in other countries. At least, and I mean the very least, Season 2 acknowledged that Section 31 was bad. Section 31 works against our heroes for most of that season, and the AI villain of the season was a result of Section 31's obsessive need for control, and characters like Captain Pike openly expressed disapproval of Section 31 itself. But here in this movie, there's not even a pretense of critique. Instead, the movie basically asks, what if CIA stuff was done by quirky weirdos? You know, just your found family of outcasts and marginalized people casually doing some extra-legal military ops, like we're wont to do, I guess. And I get, to be clear, that the Black Ops team of scrappy weirdos trying their best trope is a thing that I often typically enjoy in shows like The Boys or The Suicide Squad, but those teams are usually portrayed as mercenaries or outsiders, not a sanctioned government team, or at least the members of it are forced to be on the team. But here we have Rachel Garrett being an official Starfleet liaison to Section 31, ostensibly there to keep Section 31 in check, which kind of feels like it would defeat the purpose of Section 31 to begin with. And even worse, her character's role in the film is just to get huffy about, this isn't how Starfleet would do it.
Starfleet does not do assassination.
Before, like, inevitably coming around to their way of thinking by the end. It's the show kind of giving an explicit endorsement of the idea that the CIA is a necessary evil, that Section 31, and by extension, the CIA, are needed to keep America safe, rather than what it actually is in reality, an extension of American neo-colonialism. This framing outright downplays the agency's history of human rights abuses and covert operations, which have actively destabilized nations and suppressed progressive movements, and it doesn't help that the actors themselves seem to be leaning into this during promotion.
The simple truth of the matter is, the Federation can only exist if a Section 31 exists.
Yeah, baby.
Now, what we can do is we can take it from being a nefarious organization to humanizing it and actually showing the need for it.
Wow. I hate it.
And that completely undermines what Section 31 was created to critique. Deep Space Nine made it very clear the Federation can and should exist without a Section 31, because it goes against the whole point of the ideals of what the Federation, and by extension Star Trek itself, stands for. But this movie just abandons that nuance entirely, just turning Section 31 into a quirky, glorified arm of Starfleet. And ultimately, that's my problem with this movie. It doesn't feel like Star Trek to me. And I want to be very clear about what I mean by that, because it doesn't feel like Star Trek is a critique that gets thrown around a lot, and it can mean very different things to very different people, and it's also used in a lot of toxic ways, and I want to be clear, this is like what I like about Star Trek, not what anyone else has to like about Star Trek, But to me, the reason this movie doesn't feel like Star Trek to me is not because the movie is set outside of Starfleet. That was actually one of the things that was a strength of it for me. I have been rooting for Star Trek for a long time to break away from its Starfleet focus for a while. As much as I love my pajama-wearing nerds, there's more to the Trek universe to explore. You know, Trek has always had the potential for bold, weird ideas, from Gene Roddenberry's pitches for a Harry Mudd series and a Trek medical drama way back in the 60s, to the Klingon show that was proposed somewhere in the 90s, and it's why I'm really excited about Tawny Newsom's comedy show, and dream, personally, of one day advancing my own career enough to pitch my political thriller-style Trek series that I've had in my back pocket for a while. And we've even had glimpses of this in Picard and Prodigy, which both started outside of Starfleet, but ultimately kind of returned to it as they went along. But for me, Trek doesn't need Starfleet to work. What matters to me in Star Trek is its humanist ethos, depicting a future where humanity has focused and chosen to seek its better self by embracing self-determination, desire to connect with others, and finding delight in those that we see as different, both alien and human. And it asking us watching the show to reach for that goal today. And it's why I've been really, really critical of the conservative ethos that I've seen in recent Trek projects like Star Trek Picard Season 3 or very short Treks.
It is important we respect their customs, Bill.
Yeah, I know. But come on, Beverly. You go shake their hand then.
Even Strange New Worlds has had some biological essentialism and sociological predeterminism creep into its storytelling, which I've talked about in other video essays. And conversely, it's why I appreciate Star Trek Discovery, flaws and all, because it centers these themes. And the same goes for Lower Decks and Prodigy, the series that I think are the best Star Trek of the last decade, because they portray a future where society enables people to grow into their best selves, rather than dictating who they should be. But these are all Trek shows that have been canceled, by the way. And even in the darker Star Trek series like Deep Space Nine, which is the best Trek in my opinion, which explores how institutions like the Federation or Starfleet fail to live up to their ideals, the core ethos of Star Trek to me shines through because they focus on how people outside of Starfleet's elite on the Enterprise D or something still fight for those values within an imperfect system. That's what Star Trek is about for me, not a Starfleet aesthetic. This could have been an opportunity to build upon Deep Space Nine's conceit if the film had been willing to fully commit to showing Section 31 as bad. Like maybe show that Georgiou has grown from her fascist past and actually, while she gets recruited by the organization, she actually tries to take it down from the inside or divert it. And maybe even because of her history, she has complex feelings about it along the way, and maybe even thinks like, maybe I should actually try to keep Section 31 around or reform it. And she learns that ultimately you can't do that. There's an arc here for her character using Section 31 that I would have really liked. But instead, it feels like the movie is trying to glorify and soften the organization. And all of this leads me to a few more significant issues that I have with the movie that I need to go into spoilers to talk about, including, by the way, a couple positives. I don't fully hate the movie. There's a couple things here that I really like. So before we get into all of that, I will just say to those of you who are about to jump off, unless you're a completionist Trekkie like I am, there isn't anything in this movie here for you. It's utterly generic sci-fi that never takes advantage of even the aesthetic of Star Trek, and frankly, to me, is antithetical to the core of what I, at least, love about Star Trek. And it sucks to say that because I always want to support Star Trek projects, especially as we've been seeing a lot of projects that I've really enjoyed from Star Trek over the past few years get canceled. I never want to go in to hate on this franchise like certain other YouTubers might be trying to do, but I really have to be honest and say I think you should give this one a pass. Now we're in spoilers, so let's dive into some specifics here, because, oh boy, I need to go off a little bit. But before I get to that, since I've been bashing the movie for so long, let me start at least with a soft positive. I actually really loved the tone of the opening flashback sequence. The glimpse into Georgiou's past in the Terran Empire that started off the movie with this strong, bleak, melancholic vibe genuinely worked for me. The scene of young Georgiou killing her family also set a really powerful tone, and it also established her dark past within the context of this movie, and also laid the groundwork for the internal reckoning her character could have had in the film. And I also really appreciated too in this opening sequence how the Terran Empire's costumes were reminiscent of Imperial China. It actually felt like a thoughtful recognition of Yo's background, tying cultural signifiers into the story in a way that actually added depth by referencing China's darker imperialist history. It also gave the Terran Empire a more distinct visual identity beyond just cartoon Nazi-style fascism that we usually see it depicted with. Now, to be fair, one could argue that this might orientalize the Terran Empire a little bit and even negate its critique of Western-style fascism, but given how brief this is and how strong the fascistic Terran Empire iconography is elsewhere, I think it lands mostly okay for me. If this is the only way we see the Terran Empire being depicted from now on in this or other Star Trek projects, we might need to have an overall larger conversation, but here I actually enjoyed it. And overall, this opening had me genuinely hopeful for the rest of the movie. Sadly, that promise didn't carry through, and the dark melancholic tone set here was quickly abandoned for something much less engaging. Because even still, this opening is dripping with exposition dumps. Like, Georgiou just sits down and tells her family, and thereby us, her history with her bland ex-boyfriend, unloading this entire backstory about how they supposedly fell in love off-screen during the Terran Empire's weird fascist survival of the fittest Squid Game, Hunger Games style Emperor tournament, I guess, that they have. That's something I would have, liked to see. But it's all told, not shown to us. And when this guy does eventually show up, Georgiou immediately pushes him aside, so we never really get the sense that he really matters to her. So it's hard to care, especially when he shows back up later in the movie. And speaking of, the movie tries later to act like this mysterious villain who somehow knows Georgiou and wants the Doomsday MacGuffin from Georgiou's past she supposedly destroyed is some big twist. But come on! It's obviously the guy we were just introduced to in the opening flashback, and who was the only other guy we even see knew about the Doomsday MacGuffin. So having this guy wear a generic Darth Vader mask to have a reveal plot twist later on just feels lazy and cheap. Also, just as a side note here that may not bother anyone else, but it kind of frustrated me a little bit, I'm a little bit disappointed that we don't get any meaningful acknowledgement or exploration of Georgiou's sexuality here.
Don't be so binary. In my universe, he was pansexual, and we had DEFCON level fun together.
With most Trek series featuring strong queer and trans representation being canceled in the past couple years, and shows like Strange New Worlds dialing back its queer rep, like never addressing its choice to make Nurse Chapel bisexual, it's kind of a little bit frustrating to see Section 31 sidestep that entirely. Yes, Michelle Yeoh's Georgiou is yet another example of the depraved bisexual trope, where bisexuality is equated with a character with loose morals. Something Star Trek's Mirror Universe characters are all too familiar with. Shout out to my Dom Mom, Intendant Kira.
I knew you wouldn't disappoint me.
But even with that trope in play, considering this movie is showing the more non-Starfleet, less rigid side of the Trek universe, I wish the movie had been more willing to at least engage with her sexuality meaningfully in some way. Again, it's not necessary or needed, but just was something that disappointed me a little bit, especially, again, given the political climate we're in now. I kind of want Trek to be forward-facing and in your face with that stuff a little bit. That said, I do have to wonder how much of this plot, as it stands right now in the released product, was decided in the editing room, because oh boy, you can tell that this movie is clearly ADR'd to hell. You can practically hear how much they tried to reconfigure this film's plot in post-production. And it's even more apparent when you look at that heavy-handed, bad 2D exposition dump during the opening credits that we get. It just feels like it's there to stitch together stuff that they had to cut or rewrite because they didn't fit the re-edit of the movie. The whole film just screams last-minute patch job, and it's hard not to notice how disjointed it all feels. Again, it's giving Madam Web or David Ayer's Suicide Squad vibes, which are not the movies that you want to emulate. At the very least, they don't copy the terrible music video introductions for the team members from that movie, though we come really close to doing that during the sequence where Michelle Yeoh clocks all the lead cast members in her bar.
She's got a stick so far up her backside, it's coming out her mouth.
Speaking of Suicide Squad vibes, though, they're clearly going for that energy, considering how much they treat a lot of the characters in the movie as disposable. But unlike James Gunn, whether it's in his The Suicide Squad movie or even his recent really good Creature Commando show, where he takes the time to make me feel gutted over the death of a character I only met 20 minutes or so earlier, this movie treats deaths with the same energy as Slipknot from Ayer's Suicide Squad. Yeah, of course the character I barely knew was going to die. Also, to make matters worse, the first character to die is Mel, a Deltan, the same species as Ilea from Star Trek The Motion Picture. Deltans are a quintessentially Gene Roddenberry creation, a species whose very presence makes you wanna fuck.
My oath of celibacy is on record, Captain.
But Section 31 makes a point of saying Mel didn't take the Deltan Oath of Celibacy, which is her only character trait here, which I guess is supposed to make her fit the morally gray tone. We have, again, shades of that depraved bisexual trope. And then, of course, they kill her off first, because apparently the sexist loose women must die trope is alive and well. The heist sequence, by the way, was fine. It's nothing groundbreaking, but serviceable as a generic action sequence. I do like the idea of the out-of-phase sequencers from, I believe, the 32nd century. It's a clever way to have a unique action visual, but it doesn't really take full advantage of it, in my opinion, but it is a cool idea. Oh, also, we have aliens fucking! Gene Roddenberry would be proud. That said, I have no idea why Giorgio was even helping Section 31 to begin with. Like, every character's motivation is just very fucking absent from the movie. Like, I get why she helps them later on when she learns what the device that they're stealing is, but I really don't get why she helps them before that. Then we get the storyline of a mole on the team, and frankly, I don't care enough about these characters, nor even know them well enough to feel betrayed or upset if one of them is a mole or not. And it just results in them pointlessly running around, splitting up like a Scooby-Doo team so that the big bruiser guy can be killed off. And I guess we're supposed to be shocked that they suspect Garrett might be the mole, but it's only shocking because she's a legacy character who we Trekkies know is a moral character and does survive, not because of anything that this movie has done to build her character on its own terms. And I guess, again, it's apparently a big twist that Fuzz is the one who betrays them all, but again, I really don't care. That said, as I mentioned during my spoiler-free section, I actually really love Fuzz as a concept. I mean, come on, he's a tiny microscopic asshole bug who can't hide his emotions at all, floating around in a robotic Vulcan's body? That's just kind of a fun, weird idea, and precisely what this movie desperately needed more of: wild, outside-of-the-box concepts that makes it feel like this movie is actually trying. And I can bet some people out there might find his character annoying with his over-the-top accent and attitude.
When this is all over, just a big space, you know, for me hatchlings to tunnel and fly around and...
But, dear Shakari, he at least made the movie feel like it had a pulse. Like, when the camera dives into his mouth a couple times, I was genuinely like, oh, something visually interesting happening. What a wild concept. I also really appreciated his ability to put the golem into autopilot, because you had a few moments where it subtly hinted at his eventual reveal as the mole. I actually clocked at one point that Fuzz was subtly not as overly emotional.
Yes, I couldn't be more excited.
And I like that the movie rewarded me later on for noticing that. Like, yay, Section 31, you did it! Subtle storytelling through characterization! But okay, here's where I gotta push up my nerd glasses, because I actually found Alok's reveal of him being an augment from the eugenics wars reeking of bland fan service, just to give him an angsty history.
The eugenics wars.
I understood that reference.
Maybe if this movie is picked up for a series, his backstory will become more worthwhile later on, but taken on its own merits within this film, we've already had a lot of characters with eugenics wars, genetically engineered angst in their backstory, especially on shows like Strange New Worlds with the characters of La'an and Una, and they're done with much more complexity, I might add, even with my critiques of that show.
Could it be that you carry your family's augmentations, and you believe that because of them, you may become dangerous?
Yes, I do.
I actually do wonder that since Section 31 has been in development since, I think, 2017, the Trek showrunners might have even pulled from Alok's backstory to create La'an for Strange New Worlds, assuming that Section 31 wasn't actually going to move forward. And if that's the case, even though Alok came first conceptually, he's now the one who feels redundant. But regardless, either way, if we take this as a movie, which again is what they're selling this as, not as a TV pilot, then his backstory just feels like an over-expository Easter egg that the movie doesn't really do anything with. It honestly feels like you should have just saved that backstory for the series where you could have done something interesting with it instead of wasting it here. And And speaking of that, and I'll be very upfront, this might be my old Q yells at clouds moment, but it really kind of bothers me that Georgiou's underground bouncer was a Charon, the half-black, half-white aliens from the original series episode, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. That episode, if you haven't seen it, is the one that many people point to as like the woke episode of the original series. It's set before this movie takes place. And also in that episode, it makes clear that the Charons, Beale and Lokai that we see in that story are the last of their species. We see at the end of the episode that their entire species was wiped out by a pointless race war, that these two are still fighting regardless.
All the people are dead. They have annihilated each other. Totally.
To be fair, I have critiques of that episode. It's a bit too much both sides are equally to blame in its approach to racial justice, but I overall generally like it, and its darker ending works because it shows how self-destructive racial conflicts ultimately are. So going back to Section 31, and I know this probably won't bother most of you, but it does just irk me that we have a Charon here as a superficial Easter egg, with it basically going, hey, remember that alien from Star Trek? In a way that completely undercuts the dramatic point of their original story. And it kind of speaks volumes to me about how this movie treats Star Trek. It's all empty aesthetic with no meaning or depth. To be clear, I am fine with Easter eggs when they're not overemphasized and pointed at, and I'm also fine with retconning older stories if you're going to use that retcon to tell me a good story now. Like, you don't need to be beholden to canon or whatever. Sure, you could explain it, like maybe this Charon was off-world when their planet was destroyed, and honestly, it would make sense that a spacefaring species wouldn't all die on their planet. But why pull this alien in a way that undermines the ending of another story a little bit, just for the sake of a cheap reference? Like, if you're going to show that a Charon survived, it feels like you should do something more with it than just like saying, hey, he's here. Like, there's so many more questions and interesting things you could have done with that, and it just feels like they're strip mining the franchise here for hollow member berries without any effort to build on or comment upon its original context. And again, maybe I'm just an old Klingon screaming at Greythor here, but it just bothered me, and it ties into my larger issues with the main plot of the movie, which completely goes against what I personally love about Star Trek. Because not only is it pushing the Section 31 as a necessary evil narrative, but the villain, Georgiou's Vedic Burial-style wet blanket of an ex-boyfriend, is yet another example of the aggrieved victim of an oppressive system who goes too far in their fight against the status quo trope. Like, there's a kernel of something interesting here in the idea of a victim of Georgiou's fascistic violence, someone who she actually even cared about, returning to haunt her and her needing to try to take accountability or fix the damage or do something in that vein. But the movie also wants him to just be an out-and-out villain that we're cool with beating up in the third act. So naturally, he just wants to commit mass murder, I guess. Because unless I missed something, his plan is to steal the Doomsday MacGuffin, the Godsend, or God's Send.
Godsend or God's End?
And then go back to the Mirror Universe and set it off there so that the Terran Empire can somehow be inspired into military expansionism and invade the Federation, hopefully, and enslave everyone there. And the bad guy does this all just because he wants to get back at Georgiou.
I want Philippa Georgiou to marinate in her own defeat.
He's going to enable the very galactic fascistic empire that oppressed him in order to get revenge on one fascist who you have like a personal vendetta against. Like, wasn't his whole perspective at the start of the film about not letting the Empire destroy your goodness? And I know that that kind of comes up as a theme, but I guess they're just going with this tired trope of years of victimization blinded him with rage to the point where he'd do anything, even betray his ideals and kill innocents in order to hurt her and get revenge.
But all those years under your heel taught me who I am now.
This is the very tired trope at this point of painting victims of systemic abuse as going too far out of anger and revenge. I mean, it's the same nonsense that Marvel movies do all the time with their villains, and the same thing Picard Season 3 also pulled with its changeling villain. She was a victim of Federation war crimes who had every reason to be angry, but who was reduced to a cartoonish, going too far caricature because she teams up with the Borg Queen in that season in order to destroy the Federation. And so it just enables the story to never self-reflect on the Federation's war crimes, and instead just rush to protect the status quo from the youth overrun by the woke Borg mind virus with the nostalgia ship and its geriatric crew. And it's just shit that I really hate.
She's an executioner for her cause. We won't get anything more from her.
And all of that's just what really bugs me about this movie. We're entering into a profoundly conservative era in the US and globally. And we have tech companies like Meta kissing Trump's ring, allowing waves of transphobic, sexist, and racist hate to thrive. And studios like Disney are actively erasing queer and trans characters to appease conservative grievances. And by the way, I'm not surprised by any of that. It upsets me, but I'm not surprised. Big corporations were never going to have our backs. But starting to see that ethos kind of creep into Star Trek is honestly kind of saddening to me. Trek was never the most agitatedly radical leftist franchise outside of Deep Space Nine.
Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains.
But it was a progressive humanist vision of the future. And it kind of worries me that we're losing that a little bit, particularly at a moment where we need it most. The diverse black-led and queer-featuring shows like Lower Decks, Discovery, and Prodigy have all been canceled, and nostalgia-driven, backwards-looking projects like Picard Season 3 have been raking in mainstream and fandom praise. And even the nostalgia-driven Strange New Worlds, which I generally like, still has had some big red flags. And so you add into that this, to my mind, deeply problematic, boring Section 31 movie, and it feels like even Star Trek, the so-called progressive franchise, is starting to turn away from its flawed, yet ultimately progressive efforts that it's been building these past few years to create a more inclusive and incisive narratives, and instead turning more to quickly churning out bland products that don't take the time to introspect on the implicit biases the stories are centering that reflect the conservative turn in our mainstream culture. And also with the looming potential Paramount-Skydance merger on the horizon and more corporate consolidation around Star Trek, I honestly kind of fear for this franchise's future. We need Trek's hopeful, forward-thinking vision now more than ever. We need stories that dare to dream beyond the status quo, to ask us to see, as Gene Roddenberry himself said, a future where we take delight in differences and other life forms, to take joy in the diversity that is out there and in ourselves, in our mainstream storytelling, not just in underground, minority, or queer media that doesn't get as much attention. For better or worse, Trek is kind of the benchmark for a progressive mainstream franchise. It's not going to be the most radical thing, but it is a benchmark for it. And personally, to me, Trek is what taught me how to dream as a kid. It gave me the courage to imagine that I could be something different, to come out as trans, and to continually hold on to hope for the future. And I look at Section 31 and I wonder, where is that in this? Instead, it feels like it's just slop made on a corporate mandate to take advantage of a brand and a celebrity that had institutional cachet after she won an award, without any earnest desire by anyone who ultimately made this thing to say something with Star Trek, leading it to, perhaps incidentally, having the most conservative message of the whole modern era of the franchise, because no one bothered to care about what this movie was saying beyond just it being another Star Trek product to release and sell. Instead of leaving us with thinking about something interesting at the end, we're just left with wild, shallow celebrity Jamie Lee Curtis cameos meant to just wake us up from the numbing, consumable blandness of the rest of the movie to briefly remind us to excitedly demand the next round of soulless Star Trek branded content that we can pay for because,
ooh, an actor I like is in a franchise me likey to consume.
As much as I love Michelle Yeoh and even Jamie Lee Curtis, I would love to see her in a Star Trek series, I don't want what this movie is selling me. I can't support this. And I just worry about where this franchise is headed. Maybe Strange New World Season 3 will surprise me. I know personally some of the writers, and they're really wonderful, fantastic, and thoughtful people, but the very biological essentialist clip that they showed us at Comic-Con last year has me really worried for it.
Spock is only half Vulcan, whereas the four of us are fully Vulcan.
Is that not logical?
I really do hope Tawny Newsom's show does happen, because to me, she gets a lot of what I like about Star Trek. And if that doesn't happen, a lot is going to be riding on that Noga Landro Starfleet Academy show that's coming out, I think, in a year or two. And at the very least, that Starfleet Academy show is set further on beyond most of canon and will also be focused on a younger generation. Hopefully that'll bring back the forward-thinking energy Trek desperately needs. But as for Section 31, I'm ultimately left wondering, who the hell is this for? There's absolutely nothing here for anyone. Whether you're just looking for Star Trek branded comfort food or hoping for something with a more profound Star Trek ethos, it in fact has quite the opposite of both of those things. And it doesn't even have enough of an identity on its own sake to draw in anyone who isn't already a Trekkie. It's just kind of there. Destined to be forgotten by Trekkies like the Krenim erased timelines, and probably ultimately deleted like Janeway deletes wives by a corporation looking for a tax write-off.
Delete the wife.
Anyways, that's my review for Star Trek Section 31. If you like this video, please consider supporting me over on Patreon. I'll be honest, it's kind of been a little rough paying the bills lately. We just moved to a new place, my fiance and I. So if you do like what I do, if you want to consider supporting me in any way, shape, or form, and the other stuff that I do on this channel, please consider helping me out over there. All the other things, like, subscribe. But beyond all of that, my friends, I hope you live long and prosper.